Hello, everybody. Welcome to SecDSM. I'm so happy to be back in Des Moines. I come back to Des Moines probably every other week or so, and my schedule doesn't always line up to come to SecDSM, so I'm super excited whenever my schedule lines up to come to SecDSM. Tonight, I'm talking about web app hacking. I don't know if you've been here before. We've talked previously about hacking printers and hacking your whole network. And I'm like, I'm actually a recovering web application developer. And so I have written some poor web applications over the last 25 years. And so I know a thing or two about how to and how not to write web applications, because every mistake that could be made, I've probably already done it. And so tonight, I want to talk about web application hacking, right? Or web application penetration testing. This is what I do as my day job. I'm the penetration testing team manager and principal consultant at LMG Security. So I've been there for 3.5 years, actually almost 4 years. It's incredible. I was previously with a software as a service company where I was the original developer of a platform that's now used by about 20 million people. That was the last number I heard the other day. So now I'm on the other side. So instead of protecting people's data, I now break into systems and help other people make their systems better so that their data doesn't get stolen. Before we get started, you know the drill about cell phones, but I want this presentation to be interactive. So if you've got questions, you want to interject, you got a different viewpoint than what I'm providing you, feel free to stop, ask questions, ask a good question. I want to throw things at you, so I've got shot glasses. Yeah, right here. See, right there. And I love the interaction with the audience, with you guys. I mean, we're all part of the community. We're all learning together, doing great things, and I want this to be interactive. Yes. My social security number is 123456799. Yeah, I don't know how I got so lucky, Mr. Stark. I'm not going to be a pro football player, but I'll try. All right, so let's get into it. What is web application penetration testing? A lot of my bullet points were made by ChatGPT, but in general, what it is you're trying to abuse a web application and make it do things it wasn't intended to do. And so looking for security flaws and vulnerabilities, this is how data breaches happen, right? You've got a web application on the internet, it's got data, people figure out, how can I get that data out of that web application? And ultimately at the end of the day, that's often what attackers are trying to do. When we attack a web application, so just kind of back up, there's different kind of classifications or classes of vulnerabilities that are typically found in web applications. OWASP makes a great list. They actually come out with a top 10. I think the last top 10 they came out with was in 2021, and I heard they're going to be refreshing that list early this year. So I'm kind of excited. But things like broken access control, injection attacks, cryptographic failures, just poor design. One of my favorites is parameter tampering, right, or indirect object referencing. So there's all sorts of great, well, to me great, to you guys not so great probably, but there's different classes of vulnerabilities that can be found in web applications. And this is just, the top 10 is just a few, and the most popular ones that are out there. So what I'm going to talk about tonight is I'm going to go through several kind of case studies of things that I myself have found on web application penetration tests over the last 3.5 years. Most of them actually have been pretty recent. We get the opportunity to help a lot of organizations with their security posture. And in always, I approach this kind of with an empathetic, like, I know where you guys are at. Right? I was in your shoes. I've done a lot of these mistakes. People always ask, like, Tom, how are you so good at this? And it's because, I can get in the mindset of the developer. I've been there. I know where developers take shortcuts, or where if you're inexperienced, you might make a mistake. And so I try to kind of get in the mind of the developer so that when I'm testing your application, I'm trying to do the things that I know I've messed up before so I can help you learn from my previous mistakes. So let's dive right into it. We can talk about case number one. So we were approached by a company that that was acquiring another company, and when they acquired that company, they actually got a couple more web applications, that they were onboarding, that they were going to sell, because that's what they do. They sell web application software, and they wanted to test to see, how secure was the new applications that they just recently acquired. And I think this particular web application was doing analytics. So you generate a type of a log file, and you upload it into their platform, and that platform does some data analytics and data science kind of things, a lot of machine learning. And then it looks for patterns of things like file access and user access and things of that nature. And so I was on the scoping call actually with the client, and as they're describing how this application works, I'm already thinking about how am I going to attack this application. And actually I called it out in that scoping call where I said, they described the application that the web application sucked it in, and then they feed it to a machine learning model, and I was already thinking about that inflection point between where the web application stops and where the machine learning starts. There's probably a vulnerability right there, and I'll show you and demonstrate exactly what I'm thinking here in a second. So yeah, my evil idea was to find a vulnerability in that upload process. Right, I'm going to upload a file, and then I'm going to manipulate their software kind of in the back end blindly to see if I can get it to do something it shouldn't do. And it did. So basically, my plan was to figure out, can I do some kind of command injection? Because I figured the web application's probably calling out to a shell script that you're going to feed the file to, and it's going to do the processing on the file. And my thought was, they're probably not sanitizing the input of the file name. They're probably just taking whatever file name I uploaded and feeding that right to the other script, which is not a good idea. Anytime you're taking user input, you should never, ever, ever trust it. And any point where you're using that data input, you need to be very cautious about how you're using that data. And in this particular example, well, let's first back up what command injection is. So basically what command injection is, how many people here are familiar with command injection? And what about SQL injection? That's probably one of the most, it used to be number one on the OWASP list forever. I think it's number 3 now, because people have learned, what the vulnerability is. It's basically where, you're concatenating strings together, and people are able to stop, one string from ending and starting their own new string. So in SQL injection, you might stop a query, start a new query. I'm going to, dump data out of your database. Command injection is very similar, where, I'm running this long, maybe it's a bash command in Linux, and I'm going to stop running the first command that they want to run, and then I'm going to run my own command, and then I'm going to let whatever syntax errors happen after that. And so that's basically what command injection is all about. Now, what I did here, and you can't see this, let me zoom in. This is a page here is from Burp Suite. So Burp Suite is an application that allows you to look at every request and response to a web application. And it lets me monkey with it. It lets me manipulate data that's going to and from the server. And in this particular case, I middled this application so you can see what I'm doing. So what it is it's doing this bulk upload, and I'm uploading a file. Actually, the contents of the file was just what's called an ICAR string, which is basically every antivirus will trigger on it, right? So if I upload a file with this special string in it, everyone's antivirus will say, that's a virus, that's no good. So I'm testing actually a couple things right now at the same time. I'm saying, are you doing antivirus scanning? Which they weren't. But then more importantly, you see here the file name doesn't look like, myfile.txt. What I put in here was a single quote, a semicolon, a backtick, echo, a bunch of base 64, piped it into a base 64 decode, added some more echoes and some more backticks. And what happens is, you can see, is if you decode that base 64, it says cat/etsy/passwd, which is the password file for the server. And so in the response that came back from the server, I literally got the output of Etsy password. So I'm like, aha, I did it. I figured it out. They've got command injection. So, love it. So what do you do now? You know, it's like, okay, this is a pretty bad vulnerability. How bad can it get? And so to show them how bad it could get, I had an evil plan. I said I wanted to, you know, basically this is a test environment. This is not a production environment. Often when we do testing, we ask for a non-production environment with no customer data in it, preferably, and so that we can really test it really hard, right? Because if I'm ever testing, you know, we will test in production environments, but this is a non-production environment. So I'm like, how far can I get, right? Can I completely compromise their entire platform? So my plan was I was going to craft a malicious file like I did there, but to do something worse. This time I wanted to create what's called a reverse shell, where basically I would get I could get kind of as if I was to secure shell in and get a command line access to the machine. I was going to get that across the internet and catch this a reverse shell, and then do some things and then profit. Right? I've just got a couple more steps than the meme does. Anyway, so. This here is basically I had a box set up on the internet to catch a shell on port 443, and once I triggered it, I got a connection to my host. It came from their host, and then I ran the ID command that said I'm a Vagrant user. So this means that I actually had shell access on the box, so which means now whatever permission the web application is running at an operating system level, now I had that permission to run at. But wait, there's more. So in this particular case, I wanted to see if I could privilege escalate all the way to can I get root, right? So I actually looked on the box and I looked at the binaries that were installed, and I discovered this is around the time of Polkit. Does anybody remember Polkit? So it's basically, actually, it's a privileged toolkit for doing privileged functions on the server, and it had a major vulnerability in it that then let anybody do privileged functions on the server if you had the right toolkit. And so this was actually running, it was actually patched in 2021, and I think this test was in 2022. So the patch had already been out for about a year. But it was great because since this is actually a development server that I was on, it even had a compiler. So I downloaded from the internet the vulnerability. I used a proof of concept that we've edited. And by the way, I do not ever recommend downloading a proof of concept from GitHub and just blindly running it. You need to do source code review and put it through a vetted process, but especially if you're dealing with a customer system before ever trying to run something you found on the internet. Actually, there's some amazing proof of concepts out there that, like, if you look at the code, it's like, I'm going to delete your entire hard drive and call it a day. Like, it's bad. So be very, very cautious and careful and vet the things that you get off the internet. In this particular case, this is a great proof of concept. And I compiled it and ran it, and then once I ran it, I went from being the Vagrant user to now I am root. Root on the box is basically kind of God level mode where you're full admin of the machine, and at this point I can do whatever I wanted. It's kind of funny because actually in this particular case, they had Duo MFA set up on root. So any user that logged in, if you sudoed to root, which is normally the way that you go from a regular user to a root user, it actually came up with about 10 different phone numbers and says, which one are you that we want to send the push notification to so you can approve becoming root? And it was kind of funny because I didn't need that, right? I just used Polkit and became root, and I bypassed the entire authentication process. So just for funsies, I went through and I sent push notifications to every user to see if anybody would approve my sudo to root on the box. Nobody did. Good for them. I was actually very happy because I did it 10 times per person. There's 10 people. Eventually, Duo says, I'm not going to send any more push notifications, just so you're aware. You can make Duo unhappy about that. So they were a bit wrecked, and they're very thankful for what we found, right? Because this was a major vulnerability that was going to be released as a product of theirs with their name on it. So finding vulnerabilities like this, they could go back and they can fix it and make it better so that other people aren't going to be affected by this type of a vulnerability. All right, takeaways: validate all your inputs, restrict backend command execution clearly, and conduct regular security tests. Be it internal, do code reviews, do penetration testing, either internally, externally, both, whatever it is. But you need to be looking at your applications that are on the web with a critical eye. It's just so incredibly important because there's likely something like this in your application today and just hasn't been uncovered if you're not looking for it. All right, so that's the end of case number 1. How am I doing so far? Are you guys excited? Has this been good? You guys have any questions so far? What was that? How many cases? Oh, I've got 3 cases tonight. 3. Yeah, I figured that'd be enough. I actually have dozens to pick from, and so I kind of picked 3 of my favorites because each one of these has different different qualities to them that I want to point out. So this one's around, input sanitization, right? You can't trust stuff from users. You can't trust users at all. Yeah, right there. I'm sorry? Oh, this was a test system, and they did not have an intrusion detection system. Here you go. Yes, I almost made it. Oh yeah, all you that can't see the room, I totally threw that straight to him. All right, let's keep going. So case number 2. And so case number 2 is about API misconfiguration and privilege escalation. This was a client, this platform that we were testing was actually for doing like job handling of like work site kind of stuff. And it was interesting. So often when we test applications, we try to get everything queued up for our consultants so that, it's when the day for the testing starts, they're ready to go. They've got all the credentials they need. They've got all the access they need, and we can start doing our testing. This particular day, we kind of had a failure. And where the client got the environment all stood up, but then there's another team that was supposed to give us usernames and passwords, and those usernames and passwords weren't set up yet. And so my coworker was a little bummed. He's like, I can't do anything right now very much because I don't have any credentials. I'm like, no, let's go look, right? I mean, there's plenty that you can do without logging in. And usually it isn't a lot that you can do without logging in unless you find a major vulnerability. And so what I'm going to show you is the major vulnerability that we found. So in this particular web application, I think it was a React.js or one of these API-driven web applications where the front end is mostly HTML, and then they're doing a ton of JavaScript to call API calls, doing JSON posts and gets from the back end to do functionality of the web application to actually do your CRUD operations and so forth. Like I said, we started out without any credentials provided. So what we want to do is we want to start by looking at what were we provided with. And so even going to the login page, it's loading up all the JavaScript on the web application of what you can do with this application. And what's interesting is often on a login page, you should probably only show the functionality for login. But in this particular case, it had login functionality, it had regular user functionality, it had admin functionality, all available on the login page. And so what we started doing was we downloaded some of the login stuff, and you can see here in that JavaScript we found a function called account/register. What was super interesting is that the website didn't offer account registration sign-up. So this is a piece of functionality that was in the web application but not presented to the end user to be able to use. So they assumably, they built in that potential option, but then they said, you know what, let's just turn that off. And so we decided, wow, I bet maybe that could work. So let's figure out how we can register an account. We don't have an account anyways. Let's go ahead and see if we can do that. And so actually at first tried to log in, and I captured that JSON request of the information that it gave us to log in, and it said to create the account. And it was really helpful. So APIs tend to be really helpful for you when you make a request and you give it the wrong data. In this particular case, it says, hey, the terms and conditions must be checked. I'm like, oh, let me go look at what parameter I'm missing. And then it's like the password doesn't match because I only sent the password, one password instead of the password and the password again. So it was really helpful to tell, and it even told me like the RFCs, like, you have validation errors and here's how you correct them. And so once I validated or sent the correct parameters, then we got a successful registration. So now we had successfully registered a user where we started without authentication. Now we've got a user account. And so now what do you do with the user account once you create it? You log in. What happens when you log in this particular case? 403 unauthorized. Good for them. They had the account functionality, but it didn't actually let me do anything. So this is actually from the logged in page. It says you are unauthorized, but I was authenticated. So although I didn't have authorization to use the web application, my session was actually authenticated. So I was actually logged in. So this is now a valid session that wasn't allowed to do anything from an end user web perspective. But guess what? There's more APIs to be had. So we actually looked through all the other APIs, and we actually found one called add user. It was an administrative function. This was an administrative function. And in this particular case, as an authenticated user, I could try to add a user to the account. And what's great is that the difference between register user and add user is on add user, you could set a role. And so we set a role of super admin because we were able to enumerate what roles were available. And so we decided, let's go ahead and create a second administrative account to be a super admin, and then assigned it a password and so forth. And of course, we didn't have to go through we didn't have to go through, the accept terms of service and things like that, because this is like one admin creating another admin user. And so once we did that, we're like, yes, please let me be a super admin. There we go. Then we became a super administrator of the machine. So we literally went from no authentication access to having two accounts, one of which was a super admin, which then gave us God mode. And in this particular case, this application was tied into a lot of other systems, right? So I could go, reconfigure their SAML authentication. Their SAML integrations to other systems, some of the very serious things on their platform. They even had super administrator had access to do like file upload things. Like, do you think I could have maybe found some command injection or done other things? Like, this was bad enough. We stopped the test. This needs to be fixed. This is a major issue, right? If an anonymous user can now become God mode on your platform, this is a big problem. Anyway, so that's basically the majority of what we found with that. And the takeaways are, secure your API endpoints. So often, especially when we do API testing, so we do all sorts of different types of web application penetration testing. Sometimes it's APIs, sometimes it's like more web form or traditional old school applications. If I'm doing API application testing, I'll often ask you for a postman collection or some kind of a documentation for the endpoints that are exposed. In this particular case, I had to read the JavaScript. They didn't have any documentation, and so I just kind of figured it out. I kind of backdoored the documentation myself. But one of the things I love to do, especially if you can give me a postman collection, I'll run every endpoint without any authentication and see what will give me data. Right? Because sometimes you forget to put an authorizer on an API endpoint. And so, making sure that the functions that you expose have the right permissions for the users that you expect to be able to do those functions and not for the users that shouldn't, right? In this particular case, I was an unauthorized user that was authorized to create another user. And then, strict role-based access controls. And then, like I said, this is going to be a theme. Test your stuff, right? I mean, it's very common. I've seen this where, a client has tested their stuff, but then developers make more changes, and they're like, "Well, we only do testing once a year, but they push code every 2 weeks." So in a year, there's, approximately, 23. Or wait, what's 52 divided by 2? 26 opportunities for a new vulnerability to show up. And so, I always recommend doing major code testing and code reviews with every release, major release. Minor releases, not so much. So it's we took different strategies when I was at my previous organization, but always we would try to do code release or code reviews with every release every 2 weeks. All right, so that's the end of case number 2. Any questions? Anybody excited? Yeah. All right, love this. So now the third one is actually one of my favorites. This one was this is actually a very recent test, and where basically we were doing multiple engagements with the client at the same time, and we were testing several of their homegrown applications. This in particular was a Spring Boot web application. Anybody that does web application development often, or if you don't, just so you know, when you develop a web application, often if it's a platform where you're doing authentication, where you're doing all this fancy functionality, you're not going to write it all from scratch yourself. You're often going to pick like a web application framework or somebody else's code that's going to help you kind of kickstart some of the things that you need in order to make your web application be quick, make it give it functionality, like security things, so that you don't have to roll it yourself, right? It'll provide things like CSRF validation, or it'll do authentication even. So a lot of these things, so you'll use a framework that will help you develop your application quickly. Now, does anybody remember the Apache struts vulnerability? It's got to be like 10 or 12 years ago. Apache struts had a major vulnerability in so everybody at the time that was writing any kind of a web application in Java was probably using struts, or at least 50% of the chance that you're using struts. And so when you use a framework, you get all the features of the framework. You also get all the vulnerabilities of the framework. So a major vulnerability came out in Apache struts that then almost every security appliance I looked at the time had an Apache struts web application, and now they had this vulnerability of the framework. So there's a framework level vulnerability that now I could come off the street without any kind of authentication and pop a shell off of a security appliance on their management interface, because their management interface is being run by a web application run by Apache struts, right? So this particular case wasn't Apache struts. This is actually using Spring Boot, which is another Java-based framework. Actually, I was a Java developer for 25 years, so whenever I hear you're using Java on your back end, it just gives me that warm, fuzzy feeling, because I know what I can go after, and often I can. But in this particular case, why I love this case so much is because I've never seen a Spring Boot application before. I'd never tested one. I just hadn't run across one yet. And so doing what I do, I researched the crap out of the framework, right? I'm like, what does this framework do? Have there been any vulnerabilities in the framework? And so I always implore the guys that are here that work for the organization I used to work for, I say, when we employ a technology, we want to own and understand it deeply. I feel the same way when I test something, right? I want to understand this framework inside and out before I wouldn't even touched it. And so one of the things I did was I went and I was like, okay, what kind of vulnerabilities are out there? And I found a nice GitHub repo where people talked about potential Spring Boot vulnerabilities. Not only just like vulnerabilities in the framework, but like implementations where people have used the framework incorrectly, or maybe a project is using an old version of the framework. But what in this particular case that I discovered is that by default, there's these actuators or default URLs that come along with the framework. And so if these are enabled, which they are by default, you can go to any of these URLs on your web app. So if you've got a Spring Boot application, put in /info, and it will dump out info about your Spring Boot application. So there's about 14 of them. And I honed in on one. So the one that I loved the most from this engagement was the heap dump. So you go to /heap dump. And what a heap dump is it's basically a debug tool. So say maybe you've got, you've discovered that your web application's got a memory leak, or it's got, or you're trying to understand what's happening to some variables. A heap dump will actually take the Java virtual machine that's running your web application, take all the memory from your web application as it's running, and download it for you. And so basically you go to /heap dump, and all of a sudden you get a download of anywhere from a couple hundred megs to a couple gigs of the memory of the web application servlet container at the time when you clicked on the link. So that means anything that anybody's done in the application that hadn't been garbage collected, you now have a copy of that, whatever was in memory. And so what's cool, and because heap dumps are very important in doing debugging of web applications, is there's lots of tools out there. Here's an example of, so this is the web application. And we'll come back to this in a little bit, but this is us downloading the heap dump from our client's web application. But what we found was that there's sensitive information in this heap dump, right? If you can imagine, what is your application allowed to do? Is it connected to other services in your environment? Are there credentials in memory? How are you doing authentication? In this particular case, authentication wasn't done by the web application itself. It was actually it was connected to Active Directory. So if you had an Active Directory account, when you log in here, it did an Active Directory lookup using LDAP to verify that you got your password right. So there were no passwords for us to steal, or were there? And so in this particular case, so I used a heap dump viewer. This one is actually called Visual VM, where basically it's got a whole query language where if you're looking for a particular variable value, or you're looking for a particular variable name, you can actually have it search through the heap dump and find all the instances of it. And in this particular case, I found the LDAP connector, where then it had credentials, so that when because the way that they did lookups in the system against some other LDAP objects, so they had to have something that could query LDAP in order to do the functionality of the web application. And so I was able to come and find those variables in the heap of domain credentials. So when I found this, now I have domain credentials on this client's network. And then I also just ran strings on it. So I actually ran strings, and I found some, and I just looked for the word password, right? Case insensitively look for password, and I noticed something, that they actually had a variable called _CSRF. And usually what a CSRF token is, it's a unique value by session or by day, but basically makes it so that if you are trying to update data in the application, you have to provide a special value so that your form is authorized to update that value. And in this particular case, to make that value unique, they were actually using the username and password that they validated the user with against LDAP as part of this variable. So they would set it to this variable, and I assume they did some kind of a hash against this clear text variable that had your clear text username and password to come with the hash that then they would use for your CSRF token. I don't know if that's for sure the way it works, but it was assumably because the usernames and passwords that were here were other domain accounts. And I found, like a dozen users. So everyone that's logged into this application in recent memory, literally, I can now log in as those users onto their network. And this is what was great. And I'll come back to that previous screen, this screen here. So since we were actually doing both a web app test of focus testing on this application at the same time that, a question back there? So the question was, if I had those credentials, do I have to use the token each time, or could I create my own? It looked like it was using the session identifier. So once you're logged in, it uses your session cookie concatenated with username and password, and that was hashed, I think, to become your CSRF token. So you get a new CSRF token every time you log in this particular application. I've seen other applications where maybe it's time-based, based upon the day, and maybe your CSRF token is the same for your user account for an entire day. It's supposed to be a changing value, so what happens is it's for cross-site request forgery is the classification of vulnerability that CSRF protects you against. So like say I go to a website, and that website, someone has inserted some nasty JavaScript onto it. So if I visit that website, they can make my browser do bad things, like post a form against another URL. Well, if somebody knows that I'm logged into this application, and they know the format of like an update, cross-site request forgery is just really for when you're manipulating or updating data on a web application. I could go to this website, and if I'm logged into this other website, they could feed me a form that does an action against this website and say, submit it. So it's like they could feed me a form to say, hey, go delete this user from this database, and it would make my computer suck that, perform that action against this other website. And if you don't have CSRF token validation, it will just do it. So that CSRF is something that this evil person that puts this bad JavaScript on my page doesn't know. So that when I do that form update, or I do that update against the web application, it's not going to take it because it's like, hey, you didn't provide me a valid CSRF token or cross-site request forgery token that site would have given me to allow me to manipulate that data. So it's like watering hole attacks and things like that are what those protect against. In this particular case, so back to the story, we were doing an internal penetration test. And what was interesting, and I love going to an application, and I always ask for like, give me multiple accounts with different roles of access, and they did. But since we were doing an internal test, we had credentials for one of my other team members, and I'm like, hey, can you? He had an Active Directory account by this point. He's like, I'm like, hey, can you log into this web application? And he did, and it gave him no navigation, but let him log in. So he was logged into the app, but the app's, there's no navigation. It was just basically a blank web page. But that heap dump URL was authenticated. So if I showed up without a username and password, I wouldn't be able to get the heap dump. I had to have some kind of credential. But now this was like, as long as I had any kind of a credential, now I could go after that heap dump. So this now became, a vulnerability that was any authorized user could do to now any user that could authenticate it against the domain could do. So it, kind of stepped up that severity. And since we were doing an internal test and they developed a number of applications for this organization, I was like, you need to go run this vulnerability against every website in their organization. Try to log in, go after heap dump, right? Because, and I think we found a bunch more web applications that had this vulnerability. Now we had like, a dozen or two sets of valid user credentials in this organization. So it was Mr. Stark. So other than heap dump, what other actuators, what's that? Yeah, so other than heap dump, what other actuators provide sensitive information? There's quite a few. Actually, it's really interesting. Most of the actuators, like they may have credentials, but they were smart. The Spring Boot was smart. If they detected the word password in like a variable they wanted to send back to you in one of these pages, it would actually redact it. Some of these, so if I went to /env, often you'll introduce credentials to a database in an environment variable. The username would be there, the database server would be there, which is all very sensitive, but the password would be redacted. So that's why I really focused in on the heap dump, because it's the raw memory. It's not going to be redacting the raw memory in order to allow you to analyze that, because you're a developer and you need that, right? Or what if I'm a evil developer and I want to collect user passwords of my coworkers? This is why these kinds of things are actually really serious, and make sure that I think these are really only valid for your local development environment. I think once you start allowing other users to hit environments that have these actuators enabled, you should disable them, because otherwise you could have somebody bad on your network trying to exploit the other users on the network. Shutdown will shut down the web application. Yeah, you can actually also cause thread dumps. You can look at health and metrics and mappings. Yeah, question. What's that? Oh, what is /beans? So beans are objects that have like getters and setters, or like functionality, like Java beans. I don't know if you're familiar with that term. There's a special kind of a web object in particular, and these will give you those objects that are specified as beans. They're typically it's been so long since I used to deal with EJBs decades ago, and I've probably drank too many of those memories away. Most of these have significant issues with them, so I got clear text passwords that were domain credentials. So takeaways from this is you need to disable your debugging tools, right? I don't think any of these actuators should ever be enabled anywhere except for maybe a local environment where a developer is developing on their local machine. Anytime you're going to then get another user to log in, these really need to be disabled, because otherwise you could be leaking information you don't mean to. And then also, don't store sensitive information in memory or logs. I mean, that's kind of it's kind of crazy to think about. Like, oh, who's going to have access to the memory? Well, anybody that can connect to debugger, right? And so, clear out your variables, or don't store them, or clear them, or reset them after you've used the variable, right? So in this particular case, that CSRF variable probably should have been cleared after it had been their CSRF token had been hashed, and it wasn't. And audit security settings in your framework, right? Like making sure that, in this organization, it was interesting, their production environment didn't have this vulnerability enabled. It was only non-production environments. So they knew about, or somebody in the organization seems like they knew about this as a potential vulnerability. They just hadn't been thought of as a major vulnerability, and so they only disabled it in production. So good for them. So, I mean, that was the end of the third. Any more questions around the third example? Yeah.
You mentioned Apache struts having similar issues back in the day. Was that the one that let you break Apache for Atlassian stuff?
So the question was, the Apache struts, was that the one that enabled breaking Atlassian stuff? I don't remember Atlassian in particular having struts. It may have. I remember ClearPass, Aruba ClearPass. I got root on that, Mr. Stark. And I also remember there was I think the Dell case appliances also were running Apache struts, maybe. What's that? vCenter also at the time was running struts. Yeah. So yeah, right here. How bad is what? Jackson data bind? What? Yeah, it sounds like. Is this on the same level? Oh, is this on the same level? This is more of a feature than a bug. This is a built-in feature that's well documented. So this is functionality that comes along with. And I think by default it's enabled. I think the vulnerability was that it comes enabled by default, and so I think now it doesn't come enabled by default. So there's your fix for the vulnerability, right? And so they try. I think they're trying to make it more secure out of the box. Did you get a? I have a black one. You have? Oh, you want a blue one? My last blue one on the table. There you go. Oh, you totally caught that. All right. All right. So that was the third example. I mean, in overall, I think you've probably seen some patterns here, right? You got to sanitize. You can't trust your users. You can't trust anything they give you or tell you. You need to secure your API endpoints and enforce access controls and least privilege, right? If a user can authenticate, it doesn't mean that they are authorized, right? This is kind of the whole AAA radius, right? Thing that, authenticate, authorize, and accounting, right? And so this is where you can see that in a couple of these cases, we were authenticated, but we weren't authorized. But then we found ways to have unauthorized access. And disable your debugging tools. And regularly update your frameworks, right? And I know this is hard. I lived your life. I realized as soon as the new Spring Boot jar comes out, you're just going to drop that in your application and everything's going to be totally okay. That's a lie. I'm seeing the other developers in the room like, yeah, that isn't the case, right? You're going to break your application. You're going to get users pissed off at you. And so, I recognize, so, you've got to test, and you have to build into your sprint cycles like room for integrating the new updates of your frameworks into your application and put it as part of your development lifecycle. And if you don't budget for that, you're never going to do it. And then eventually you're going to be so far out of date that you're going to be like, well, do we just rewrite the entire application, or do we go through 6 months of hell of not actually doing development of new features and functionality and in order to mitigate this vulnerability? So I think that's all I've got. Web app. One of my coworkers made some of these slides for me, and he put in some funny things that make me laugh. But by the way, want to let you know, I actually teach a couple or teach a class called Pen Testing for IT Professionals. I'm actually giving this class at the end of the month. It's not on web application hacking. It's more on some of the low-hanging fruit on your networks. I'm a firm believer that, like, if you hire me to come do an internal penetration test and you've never done one before, there's I can almost write the report before I show up. And so the point of this class is to help you look critically at your network and fix a lot of the low-hanging fruit before I show up and show you some really cool things to do. And so if you're interested at all, you can find that. We actually have a code for getting $100 off the class. And so if you're interested, go ahead and I'd love to see you at the end of this month on the 27th. It's virtual, so it's not in person. I'll be in Montana at the time, and we can all Zoom together for a whole day. And so it's all this stuff, but from a network perspective. But anyways, thank you so much. If you want to connect with me, you can find me on LinkedIn. I'm on all the social medias creatively as Tom Pohl, usually without a space. Come, let's engage. And I'm on Discord as well. So, any other questions or comments, concerns? Yeah, right here.
So, as you're going through the use cases, you had a lot of outputs that were delivered to like product owners, developers. What about the security side of things? What outputs did you deliver to them?
So the question was, they looked like we delivered a lot of outputs to product owners, but what did we deliver to the security people? Actually, this is the same report. This is actually what I delivered to the security people. And so we always, when we deliver a finding, we show you how to recreate the finding, right? We show you the evidence of what this finding is, and then we give you guidance on how to remediate it. And then so that then you can, test it over and over again until you've fixed it, right? And so that's what we do. Did I give you a shot glass? All right. Otherwise, you're real close. I bet I could get you with it. Yeah, question? Are these slides available? I mean, we can make them available. YouTube's going to be available. I don't see any reason. There's nothing here that I can't share. So, yeah. Any other questions? Well, thank you for your time. This has been a whole lot of fun. And if you guys want to see anything else, just let me know. And I love making these presentations and coming back to Des Moines. So, if there's anything else you want to see, I've made all the mistakes in life. So, thank you.